Well, our next award is our Lifetime Achievement Award. This is presented to leaders who have devoted their careers to advancing tax principles in the public square. And there's perhaps no one who better exemplifies those principles given the current uncertainty that is happening on the world stage than tonight's honoree. Ambassador Jack Matlock is a career diplomat who has served on the front lines of American diplomacy during the Cold War. He was deeply involved in the peaceful resolution of the Cold War, serving as U.S. ambassador to the Soviet Union from 1987 to 1991 under both President Reagan and President Bush. And since the end of the Cold War, Ambassador Matlock has focused on applying the lessons from that experience to the public policy issues of today. And I think that unlike too many in the foreign policy establishment, Ambassador Matlock realized that the geopolitical realities really did change significantly after the fall of the Soviet Union. In a 1997 testimony before the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, Ambassador Matlock had the courage to be a lonely voice against expanding NATO, saying, quote, "I think that to bring in new members at this time under these conditions is a misguided policy. And if it should be approved by the Senate, that it should go down in history as a profound strategic blunder." Well, in the over 25 years since now, we've seen a dramatic expansion of NATO. And in response to Russia's invasion of Ukraine last year, war hawks on both sides of the aisle, just across the river in Washington, are escalating our involvement, risking a hot war with the nuclear power. As has been the case numerous times throughout his career, Ambassador Matlock has been proven right. Now, we at TAC were honored to have Ambassador Matlock speak at our 2017 Foreign Policy Conference. This was one of the first events that I was involved with during my tenure at TAC. We held it at George Washington University, so we had many students in attendance. And I still remember that of all of the distinguished speakers that we had there that year at that conference, the one for whom I received the most media and meeting requests was Ambassador Matlock. And I think that speaks to just how important his career has been. It's our honor to have him join us here tonight and present him with TAC's Lifetime Achievement Award. Please join me in welcoming Ambassador Jack Matlock.
Well, thank you very much. You know, if I have achieved anything, it has not been in any way a solo performance. I have been lucky enough to have support in many ways for the things we were trying to do. First of all, I would say I had support throughout my marriage to the late Rebecca, who worked with me and became, I think, very influential in improving the image of the United States with the people in the Soviet Union. I was also lucky enough, when I was ambassador to the Soviet Union, to have probably the finest diplomatic staff that the United States has ever enjoyed. We had diplomats who had contacts as Gorbachev was opening up the country, throughout the country, and they were able to report things that were going on so that we understood better than President Gorbachev what was happening in his own country, because he was being fed often lies by the KGB. Now, I'm delighted this evening that 3 of our diplomats who worked with us in Moscow are with us this evening. They too worked as husband and wife team. And I'm very happy to have John Evans and his wife, Donna, and also Richard Miles and his wife, Sharon, and Raymond Smith and his wife, Ann Miller. Let me tell you that the embassy in Moscow reported 18 months before it happened that the Soviet Union was likely to break up. This is before anyone, including the CIA, thought that was possible. That telegram was written by Raymond Smith, who is here this evening. And I'm very glad that they can be with us. But most of all, it was the pleasure and privilege of working with Ronald Reagan and George Shultz, who took on many of the people in the Reagan administration who argued that you couldn't negotiate with the Soviet Union, you only had to oppose them and bring them down. And you know, over a period of about 4 years, we went from the sort of confrontation the Europeans were calling a second Cold War to what was the ideological end of the Cold War at the time the Reagan administration ended. Now, that would not have happened if we had not had in the Soviet Union at that time Mikhail Gorbachev as a leader and Edward Shevardnadze as the foreign minister. The fact that these people, Reagan and Gorbachev, Shultz and Shevardnadze, were able to cultivate a relationship of openness and striving for the same end because they all understood that the Cold War made no sense and that we were putting into arms, and particularly nuclear weapons, enough to destroy the earth of humanity if they were all used. This made no sense to either. And so behind the negotiations. But there were, as I think now, about how different our diplomacy was then and what maybe passes for it, or it hardly deserves the name today. I would point out just a few things. At the height of the Cold War, President Reagan wrote just a few pages of what he expected in his first meeting with Gorbachev. And first of all, he recognized that Gorbachev was not a dictator, that he had to answer back to the Politburo, and therefore he couldn't be made to seem the loser. Second, he made observations about the importance of human rights and why dealing with this publicly, and I would say accusing them, was actually going to hurt the ones, and that what we support for human rights had to be carried out privately. And he made it his main task to develop a relationship with Gorbachev. And he ended by saying, whatever we achieve, we must not call it victory. Now, obviously, I don't have time to go through the various steps, but I will say that when they last met in December 1988, just a few weeks before President Reagan ended his term of office, Reagan noted in his diary, his private diary, that Gorbachev and I parted as partners to make a better world. Now, what happened then? Well, the Cold War certainly had ended by 1989 with the liberation of Eastern Europe. But then suddenly we started saying, and this was first said by President Bush, the first President Bush, we won the Cold War. Now, wait a minute. We negotiated an end to the Cold War to the benefit of everybody. There were no losers, there were only winners. Then the second thing was that the Soviet Union broke up finally in December 91. And people started saying, oh, this is a great victory in the Cold War. It wasn't. While we had steadfastly maintained that the three Baltic countries, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, should be granted their independence. We never recognized they were part of the Soviet Union. And by the way, the last official act of the Soviet State Council, when Gorbachev was still president, recognized the independence of these three Baltic countries. But we were not trying to break up the Soviet Union. In fact, Reagan had excluded trying to break up the Soviet Union because he knew that if you try to do it, you're going to simply make them stronger and more hostile because of outside power. And also President Bush, who had used the phrase, we won the Cold War, when he saw that he might lose the election for re-election. But he also understood that it was not in the American interest for the Soviet Union to break up so long as Gorbachev was trying to democratize the country and had already renounced the Marxist-Leninist ideology. And therefore, he made his speech in Kiev. I think it was September 2nd, 1991, when he warned the Ukrainian Rada against suicidal nationalism. However, that speech was called by here his Chicken Kiev speech. But actually, he was profoundly right. But then we began to act as if, in fact, Russia was a defeated country. And we, over time, did not answer any of their requests to be included in European security and their own things guaranteed. Now, underlying all of this, I think there has been, I would say, a profound philosophical mistake in what we began to assume. I want to read you one quote from a famous article by Francis Fukuyama, 1993, in a book called The End of History. Quote, "What we may be witnessing is not just the end of the Cold War or the passing of a particular period in post-war history, but the end of history as such. That is, the end point of mankind's ideological evolution and the universalization of Western liberal democracy as the final form of human government." I guess when I read it, what a claim. And then attached to this was the idea that we are now the sole superpower. Well, yes, We had the strongest military, the strongest economy, but the idea that that gave us the power to transform other countries. After all, if democracy is the rule of the people, by and for the people, how can outsiders create it? And the fact is they can't. And to embark on a road that you would, even by military force if necessary, try to change other governments, I think was not only extremely, I would say almost naive, but it was also a repeat of the mistake the Soviet Union had made. After all, what we call the Brezhnev Doctrine was predicated on the Marxian prediction by Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, that the world would be what they call socialist by revolution. And therefore, the Brezhnev Doctrine was that if another state had achieved socialism, it was the responsibility of the Soviet Union to preserve that. And that was their excuse for invading countries in Eastern Europe when they began to try to throw off the communist control. We seem to start to doing the same thing in the name of democracy. Now let me just conclude by quoting from some prominent Americans regarding some of these issues I've talked about. The first I'd like to quote is Senator Fulbright, the only senator who voted against the Vietnam War from the very beginning. He wrote, "Power tends to confuse itself with virtue, and a great nation is particularly susceptible to the idea that its power is a sign of God's favor, conferring upon it a special responsibility for other nations, to make them richer or happier or wiser, to remake them, that is, in its own shining image. Power confuses itself with virtue and tends also to take itself for omnipotence. Once imbued with the idea of a mission, a great nation easily assumes that it has the means as well as the duty to do God's work." The second, I want to quote from one of our great warriors who also became president, Dwight Eisenhower. In his farewell speech, this is what he said: "Every gun that is made, every warship launched, every rocket fired signifies, in the final sense, a theft from those who hunger and are not fed, those who are cold and are not clothed. The world in arms is not spending money alone. It is spending the sweat of its laborers, the genius of its scientists, the hopes of its children. This is not a way of life at all, in any true sense. Under the cloud of threatening war, it is humanity hanging from a cross of iron." And I think many of us remember the advice in George Washington's, to reach back in our history, the advice in George Washington's farewell address, to avoid any entangling alliances. He recognized that sometimes alliances are necessary in an emergency. But he said, that we should never confuse another country's interests with our own. But finally, I'm sure that most of us have recalled the phrase that John Quincy Adams used in his address to the American people on July 1st, 1821. However, I think it is important, although it's a little long, to listen to what he said and how he concluded. Listen to this. Wherever the standard of freedom and independence has been or shall be unfurled, there will America's heart, her benedictions, and her prayers be. But she goes not abroad in search of monsters to destroy. She is the well-wisher to the freedom and independence of all. She is the champion and vindicator only of her own. She will recommend the general cause by the countenance of her voice and the benignant sympathy of her example. She well knows that by once enlisting other banners than her own, were they even the banners of foreign independence, she would involve herself beyond the power of extrication in all the wars of interest and intrigue, of individual avarice, envy, and ambition, which assumed the colors and usurped the standard of freedom. The fundamental maxims of her policy would insensibly change from liberty to force. The frontlet upon her brow would no longer beam with the ineffable splendor of freedom and independence, but in its stead would soon be substituted an imperial diadem, flashing in false and tarnished luster in the murky radiance of dominion and power. Friends, isn't that where we are now?